What would you do if you woke up one morning and found out your land, your own private property, was no longer yours? Not because you sold it, not because of unpaid taxes, but because a group of smug bureaucrats decided to take it for themselves? That was exactly what happened to me. I was halfway through my morning coffee when I opened the letter. At first, I thought it was another bill, maybe some tax notice. But no, this was something far worse. According to the pristine, official-looking document, my 50-acre ranch, the same land my grandfather had broken his back working, the same land I had poured my blood, sweat, and beer money into, was no longer mine. At least, not entirely. I squinted at the words, reread them, and then did the only logical thing, I laughed. Hard. The laughter died the moment I reached the next paragraph, effective immediately, all fences, barriers, or private property signage must be removed in accordance with HOA guidelines. The mug slipped from my hand, shattering into 100 pieces on the floor. A slow, creeping heat spread through my chest. These people weren't joking. They were actually trying to steal my land. Less than an hour later, I was standing at my front gate when a tan sedan rolled up my driveway like it owned the place. The HOA logo on the side was ridiculous, some cheap, wannabe official emblem that made my teeth grind. The door opened, and out stepped Linda Carmichael, a middle-aged woman with a round figure squeezed into a blazer 3 sizes too small. She adjusted her clipboard and strutted up to me with the kind of confidence only people who had never been punched in the face had. Behind her, 2 other board members hovered like vultures over fresh roadkill. "Mr. Walker," she said, her voice syrupy with fake politeness, "we sent you the notice regarding the community land designation. We'd like to discuss the next steps." I folded my arms, staring at her. I let the silence stretch, watching the slight twitch in her forced smile. "Next steps?" I finally said. "Yeah, I got a next step. It's called trespassing laws." Linda let out a small chuckle, the kind people give when they think you're amusingly stupid. "Oh, I think there's a misunderstanding," she said. "You see, our board voted unanimously to include your land within the HOA's jurisdiction. Since your ranch has historically been accessible to community members for hiking and leisure, we felt it was in the best interest of." Historically? I cut her off. "The only thing this land has historically been used for is ranching. And my land isn't part of your HOA. Linda gave me a patronizing smile, tilting her head like she was explaining something to a slow child. "It is now." I stared at her, waiting for the punchline. None came. She actually believed this nonsense. Behind her, the 2 board members nodded along like well-trained parrots, and for the first time, I felt a very real urge to throw something. Instead, I forced a slow breath through my nose and kept my voice even. "Let me get this straight," I said. "You people, who don't own a single blade of grass on this land, held a little vote and decided my private property belongs to you?" Linda's smile widened, like she was proud of herself. "Not to us, Mr. Walker. To the community." I was still processing the absolute insanity of this when a silver SUV rolled up my driveway. The doors popped open, and out spilled a family of 4, 2 parents, 2 kids, and a golden retriever. They didn't knock. They didn't ask. They just walked onto my property like they were at a public park. "Whoa, whoa, whoa," I snapped, marching toward them. "What do you think you're doing?" The dad, a balding man in a golf shirt, smiled at me like I was the intruder. "Oh, the HOA opened up this land for public use," he said, tossing a frisbee to his son. "Figured we'd check it out." I turned to Linda, rage boiling over. "Get these people off my land. Now." Her eyes widened in mock innocence. "Oh, Ethan, there's no need for hostility. This transition will be easier if we all work together." I took a step closer, my patience officially gone. "Linda, I swear on my granddaddy's grave, if you don't get off my property, I will personally escort you down the driveway with a garden hose." That finally got a reaction. Linda's smugness flickered, just for a second, before she recovered, straightening her blazer. "Well," she sniffed, "I suppose we'll have to escalate this matter." She turned on her heel and stormed back to her car, her lackeys scuttling after her. The trespassers, finally sensing something was off, started shuffling back to their vehicles. As Linda climbed into her sedan, she gave me one last look. "You'll be hearing from our lawyer." I grinned, slow, low, and mean. "You'll be hearing from my shotgun." The moment they were gone, I grabbed my phone and dialed Ray Whitaker, my lawyer. Ray wasn't just any lawyer, he was a specialist in crushing overreaching HOAs. The kind of guy who enjoyed lawsuits the way most people enjoyed a cold beer on a hot day. He answered on the first ring. "Ray," I said, voice tight with anger. "I've got a situation." 20 minutes later, I was sitting in his office, still brimming with frustration as I laid out the entire ordeal. Ray listened, nodding occasionally, his expression unreadable as he took notes. When I finally finished, he leaned back in his chair, chewing thoughtfully on the end of his pen. "Ah," he sighed. "The classic HOA land grab." He said it like he had seen this 100 times before, and that only made my blood boil more. "They don't have legal grounds," he continued, "but they're banking on you rolling over. These people don't fight fair. They bury you in red tape, fines, and lawsuits until you give up or go broke." I frowned. "So how do I stop them?" Ray smirked. "You don't just stop them." He leaned forward, eyes gleaming. "You fight dirty." That was all I needed to hear. By noon, I was at the county records office, digging through every legal document I could find on the HOA's jurisdiction. It didn't take long to find exactly what I expected. My land had never been part of their territory. Never signed over. Never included. The HOA had no legal claim whatsoever. But then I found something even better. Linda had filed paperwork attempting to annex my property under some obscure, community development clause. It was nonsense, fraudulent nonsense, but the kind of nonsense that, if left unchallenged, could cost me everything. That night, I was back at my ranch, reinforcing my fences. If they thought they could intimidate me into submission, they had another thing coming. I wasn't just fighting back. I was preparing for war. The first counterattack came fast. The next morning, I woke up to a fine from the HOA, $10,000 for violations of community landscaping regulations. The letter claimed my fencing was unauthorized, my signs were disruptive, and my security cameras were an invasion of neighborly peace. I let out a short, humorless laugh. This wasn't about community aesthetics. This was a setup. They were trying to drown me in fines and fees, pushing me into debt so they could place a lien on my property and force me to sell. I called Ray immediately. "They're going for the lien strategy," I said. Ray cursed under his breath. "They're accelerating the playbook. That means they know they're on shaky legal ground. We need to hit them back, hard." I was already one step ahead of him. That afternoon, I stormed into the HOA office, folder in hand, and slammed it onto Linda's desk. She barely looked up, her smugness still intact, but I could see the faintest flicker of unease behind her eyes. "Ethan," she greeted smoothly, as if we were old friends. "I assume you're here to discuss compliance with the new regulations?" I leaned forward, lowering my voice. "I'm here to give you a bill." She raised an eyebrow but flipped open the folder. Inside were the official county records confirming my land had never been under HOA jurisdiction, until they decided to annex it illegally. And since the HOA now claimed ownership, that meant they owed me 20 years' worth of unpaid HOA dues for the land they had supposedly managed. The amount? Just over $200,000. Linda's face turned a shade of pale I didn't think was possible. "This," she stammered. "This is absurd." "No," I said coolly. "What's absurd is you thinking you could steal my land. So here's the deal, either the HOA pays me everything they owe, or we take this fight to court. And trust me, Linda, a judge is going to have a field day with your fraudulent land grab." She pressed her lips into a thin line, her hands gripping the edges of the folder like a lifeline. "The board will never agree to this," she finally said. I shrugged. "Then I suggest you find a way to make them." I turned to leave, then paused at the door. "Oh, and one more thing, until this is settled, I'll be making a few modifications to my property." That evening, I doubled down on security. By the time the sun set, I had ordered enough industrial-grade fencing to make Alcatraz look like a playground. Motion sensors, floodlights, surveillance cameras, the works. But the best part? The electric fencing. Nothing lethal, of course. Just enough voltage to make trespassers seriously regret their life choices. By noon the next day, word had spread. Curious neighbors gathered at the edges of my property, whispering among themselves. Some looked concerned. Others looked amused. Linda, however, looked furious. She stormed up to my front gate, flanked by 2 HOA board members, a clipboard clutched in her fist. "This is a clear violation of HOA regulations," she seethed. I leaned lazily against the fence. "Funny. I don't remember agreeing to any HOA regulations." She huffed, flipping through her paperwork. "Electric fences are dangerous. So is trespassing," I said. "But since you and your little club are so determined to claim my land, I figured I'd make it more community-friendly." Her eyes darted to the massive LED sign I had installed at the entrance of my ranch. In bright, flashing letters, it read, "Warning, trespassers will be zapped." Linda's jaw clenched so tight, I thought her teeth might crack. "You're out of control." I grinned. "No, Linda. I'm just warming up." That weekend, I had just settled into my porch with a cold beer when I heard the low rumble of machinery. At first, I thought it was one of my neighbors doing some late-night landscaping, but then the sound grew louder, closer. Something wasn't right. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, and that's when I saw it. A bulldozer. Rolling slowly up my driveway. Behind it, a handful of workers in safety vests stood waiting, their gazes darting between me and the woman standing at the front of the group, Linda Carmichael. She was dressed as if she had just come from some upscale dinner party, her expensive blazer pristine despite the dirt and sweat she was about to make someone else deal with. Clipboard in hand, she looked at me and smiled like she had already won. My blood turned to ice. I stalked forward, stepping directly into the bulldozer's path. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Linda sighed, like I was some stubborn child refusing to go to bed. "Mr. Walker, your fences are in violation of community regulations. The HOA has every right to remove them." I let out a slow breath through my nose, my hands curling into fists. "Linda, if you tell that operator to move one more inch, I swear, you'll regret it." She smirked. "You're free to file a complaint with the board." I turned to the construction crew, my voice dropping to something cold and sharp. "This is private property. If you so much as touch my fences, I will sue every single one of you into the next century." That did it. The crew hesitated, looking between each other, clearly not willing to get caught in the crossfire of what was rapidly escalating into a legal nightmare. Linda's smirk faltered. She gave a tight-lipped smile, adjusting her blazer. "Well, I suppose we'll handle this differently," she said, turning on her heel. The crew followed, the bulldozer reversing down my driveway. I watched them go, but I knew this wasn't the end. It was a test. She wanted to see if I'd back down. She had no idea who she was dealing with. The next morning, I woke up to another letter from the HOA. A $10,000 fine for unauthorized fencing, aggressive signage, and disruptive landscaping. I chuckled, shaking my head. They weren't even trying to be subtle anymore. I picked up my phone and called Ray. "They're trying to hit me with fines now," I said. "We both know they can't enforce them, so what's the play here?" Ray let out a slow exhale. "They're setting up a lien, Ethan. If you ignore the fines, they'll claim you owe the HOA money. And if you owe them money, they can move to foreclose." I felt my stomach drop. That's what this was about. They were trying to financially break me. But they weren't going to. "All right," I said. "Let's hit back." I doubled down on security measures. If they wanted a war, I'd give them one. I reinforced my fences with industrial-grade wiring. Installed motion sensors, high-powered floodlights, and top-of-the-line security cameras. But the real kicker? The electric fencing. Nothing lethal, of course. Just enough voltage to make any trespasser think twice about setting foot where they didn't belong. Word spread fast. By noon, curious neighbors had started gathering at the edge of my property, whispering among themselves. Some looked concerned, others amused. But the real show started that afternoon. The HOA, in an unbelievable display of audacity, decided to hold a community picnic on my land. I wasn't even surprised when I saw them, dozens of people setting up folding chairs, blankets, and grills right in the middle of my pasture. Kids ran around with kites. Dogs chased frisbees. Someone even had the nerve to set up a volleyball net. It was like they had officially decided my ranch was public property. I leaned against the fence, beer in hand, waiting. It didn't take long. One overly eager jogger, headphones in, ran straight into the electric fence. There was a loud crackle, followed by an undignified yelp as he stumbled backward, landing flat on his back. I took a sip of my beer. A few feet away, a group of kids playing soccer kicked their ball into the fence. One of them rushed forward to grab it, only to be met with a sharp zap that sent him yelping back to his parents. Screams. Confusion. Chaos. It was glorious. And then, like clockwork, here came Linda. She stormed through the crowd, her face redder than I'd ever seen it. "This is illegal," she shrieked. I grinned. "Nope. Perfectly within county regulations." She huffed, flipping through her paperwork like she could manifest a law that didn't exist. "Electric fences are dangerous. So is trespassing," I said. "But hey, since you and your little HOA are so determined to claim my land, I figured I'd make it more community-friendly." Her eyes darted to the massive LED sign I had installed at the entrance of my ranch. In bright, flashing letters, it read, "Warning, trespassers will be zapped." Linda's hands trembled around her clipboard. "You're out of control." I smirked. "No, Linda. I'm just warming up." The fallout from the electric fence incident spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Word got out fast, the rancher on the edge of town wasn't rolling over for the HOA. The picnic fiasco had turned into a full-blown community spectacle, and whether people admitted it or not, most of them were thrilled to see Linda finally meet her match. But Linda? She was seething. The very next day, I found another HOA notice taped to my front gate, a cease and desist order demanding that I remove the electric fencing and all other aggressive deterrents. I barely finished reading before my phone rang. Ray. He was laughing. "They actually think this is gonna work?" I asked, shaking my head. "Oh, they know it won't," he said. "They're just hoping you don't know that." I grinned. "So what's our move?" "We send our own letter," Ray said, still amused. "One that reminds them of a little thing called financial responsibility." An hour later, the HOA board received a counter-demand stating that if they continued to claim my land as community property, then they were financially responsible for its upkeep. That meant paying for fencing maintenance, security costs, liability insurance, back taxes for the last 20 years. By the time the numbers were crunched, the HOA owed me so much money they'd have to start charging every homeowner triple just to cover the costs. Linda lost her mind. 2 days later, she called an emergency HOA meeting. I wasn't invited. Didn't need to be. News traveled fast when a ship was sinking. By the time I showed up to the community center that night, the place was packed. Homeowners who had once blindly followed Linda now looked furious. She sat at the head of the table, hands clenched around her clipboard like it was the last thing keeping her afloat. An elderly man, Frank Hughes, one of the longest-standing residents in the neighborhood, stood up first. "We've had enough," he announced, voice shaking with anger. "Linda, under your leadership, this HOA has gone from a simple community association to some kind of dictatorship. You overstepped your bounds, you cost us thousands of dollars, and you nearly got us sued into the ground." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Linda opened her mouth to defend herself, but Susan Carter, another homeowner, cut her off. "You told us Ethan's land was legally ours." Her voice was sharp, furious. "You lied. And because of you, my family has to pay an extra $5,000 in HOA fees this year just to cover the legal costs. Are you gonna reimburse us for that, Linda?" Linda's face flushed an ugly shade of red. "I was acting in the best interests of the community," she tried. From the back of the room, I let out a slow chuckle. Everyone turned. I took my time, pushing off the wall where I'd been leaning. "No, Linda," I said, my voice carrying through the room. "You were acting in the best interests of yourself." The room was silent. Linda's jaw locked. "You don't even belong to this HOA, Walker." I smirked. "Oh, but I do. Remember? You forced my property into your jurisdiction." A ripple of shock spread through the crowd as people finally understood what I was saying. Linda had been so determined to claim my land that she had unknowingly given me the power to vote on her removal. Someone motioned for the vote to begin. It wasn't even close. One by one, hands shot up in favor of removing Linda Carmichael as HOA president. The final count was so overwhelmingly against her that she didn't even bother waiting for the official announcement. Linda slumped back into her chair, pale and trembling. It was over. The HOA was turning on its own queen. I stood up, tipping my hat toward her as I made my way to the exit. "Tough break, Linda," I murmured as I passed. "Guess you should have checked the fine print." She didn't respond. Probably because she was too busy realizing that, for the first time in her life, she had lost. 2 days after Linda's humiliating downfall, a moving truck pulled up to her house. I stood on my porch, arms crossed, watching as she barked frantic orders at the movers, her usual smugness replaced with barely controlled panic. Her reign was over, and she knew it. No power, no influence, no HOA throne to sit on. Now, she was just another disgraced bureaucrat packing up her life and running from the mess she created. I should have felt bad. I didn't. Later that evening, there was a knock on my door. Standing on my porch were a few remaining HOA board members, looking far less confident than usual. Derek Reynolds, the youngest of the bunch, cleared his throat awkwardly. "So, we've been talking," he started. "And since Linda's gone, we need a new president." I narrowed my eyes. "Let me stop you right there. If you're about to ask what I think you're about to ask, the answer is hell no." Derek raised his hands. "Hear us out. We know the HOA's been a disaster. We need someone strong, someone who won't let power go to their head." I scoffed. "Not interested. Susan Carter, one of the homeowners who had turned against Linda, stepped forward. "Ethan, if you take over, you could dismantle the HOA entirely." That made me pause. "Say that again." "If you become president," she said, "you could vote to dissolve it. No more ridiculous rules. No more fees. No more power trips." I took a long moment, considering the offer. Running an HOA? Hell no. But burning it to the ground, legally and permanently? That had potential. I exhaled sharply. "Fine. I'll do it. On one condition." Derek nodded eagerly. "Anything. I don't want to hear a single complaint when I burn every one of your HOA rule books." A week later, it was official. The HOA was dissolved by unanimous vote. Homeowners were finally free. No more nitpicky fines. No more ridiculous grass height restrictions. No more tyrannical power trips. To celebrate, I threw the biggest barbecue the neighborhood had ever seen. The smell of smoked brisket filled the air, beer flowed freely, and for the first time in years, people actually looked happy to be living here. Ray showed up halfway through the party, shaking his head in amusement. "You really did it," he said, grabbing a plate of ribs. "You destroyed an HOA." I smirked. "Told you I'd fight dirty." He laughed. "What are you gonna do with all your free time now?" I glanced toward the horizon, where my newly reinforced fences stood tall and unchallenged. "Oh, I'll think of something." I took a slow sip of my beer, watching the sunset over the land that was mine again. No one would ever take it from me. Not an HOA. Not a bureaucrat. Not a single soul. But that's my story. Now here's my question for you. Have you ever felt powerless against an HOA, or a Karen? Share your experiences below, let's see who had it worse.